So my title is Bees versus Robots. I am going to talk mainly about bees, to be honest, but I will get on to robots briefly. So I've been studying bees for 25 or so years. And before I talk about some of the more serious aspects of what's going on with bees, I wanted to start out by correcting a misapprehension that a surprising number of people have. Many people that I encounter think there's just one species of bee, that it lives in a box and it makes honey and it pollinates everything. I'm guessing probably because you're not a random selection of society that you know that that isn't true. But nonetheless, I think it's worth reiterating. There are actually 20,000 species of bee in the world. They all pollinate crops or wildflowers. And they're all important in their different ways, and we shouldn't forget about them. So I'm just going to start by showing you some pretty pictures of some nice bees, very briefly. So in the UK, we have about 270 species of bee. This is one of them. This is a leafcutter bee. You could find this in your garden. We also, in the spring, have hairy-footed flower bees. You can see those in London parks close to here. Called the hairy-footed flower bee because the males have hairy front feet that they stroke the face of the female with when they're mating. We have bees that look like wasps. This is a cuckoo bee that sneaks into other bees' nests and lays its eggs. If you leave Britain, we have all sorts of beautiful bees. These are blue-banded armadillos from Asia and Australia. Look at that thing. This is a blue carpenter bee from China. I've never been there, I've never actually seen them, but one day I must go and see the blue carpenter bee. There are orchid bees in South America, called orchid bees because the males visit orchids and they collect the floral volatiles and they stuff them into their swollen hollow hind legs. That's what that bit is, bottom right. And then when they find a female orchid bee, they waft their legs at her and hope that she likes the aroma. And then there are bumblebees, which are my kind of speciality. They're the ones that I study. There are 250 species of bumblebee in the world, about 25 in the UK. Lovely. They're the big kind of furry, the most obvious bees, actually, that you'll see in your garden, the local park, or wherever. Sadly, bees are declining. So I'm just going to show you two examples. This is a British one, the great yellow bumblebee. One of our 25 bumblebee species. And the distribution map on the right shows you where it was found in the first half of the 20th century, and then the second half of the 20th century, and today. So it used to be found all over England and Wales, but is now extinct in England and Wales. And if you want to see one, you've got a long drive on your hands, and probably a boat journey too. They're clinging on to the very north and west of Britain. And they're not alone in having declined like this. In fact, 3 species have gone completely extinct in the UK in the last 100 years. I'll give you one more example from somewhere else in the world, because these problems aren't confined to the UK at all. This is Franklin's bumblebee. So the inset map shows you the west coast of the United States. There's California at the bottom and Oregon at the top. And the red dots show you where this species lived. So it straddled the border between California and Oregon. But sadly, this species is now globally extinct. It hasn't been seen since 2006. It's gone. It's possible, just possible, that one might turn up somewhere in the mountains, but I doubt it. The one thing something that I don't know why I find this particularly poignant, but it seems to me particularly sad that it shows how recent digital cameras are. That nobody took a nice picture of this bee before it went extinct. That's why I have to show you one with a pin through it. Now, I don't know why that matters, but that does seem even more sad to me. Anyway, poor Franklin's bee has had it. Now, these declines should really worry us because we need bees. I'm sure you know this, but nonetheless, it's worth reiterating. 75% of the crops that humans grow in the world benefit from being pollinated by some kind of insect. It's not always a bee, sometimes it's a hoverfly or a beetle or a wasp or whatever. But without those creatures, we wouldn't have most of the crops that we grow. There's a slight anomaly, so it's 75% of crop varieties or species that we grow need pollinating. but they only account for about a third of our food by weight. But nonetheless, it's the tasty third. So if you took away pollinators, we wouldn't have strawberries or raspberries or blueberries or tomatoes or chili peppers or courgettes or aubergines, or I could go on, but I'll spare you. We wouldn't have, worse to imagine, a world in which there was no coffee or chocolate. It would be a catastrophe. But they're both crops that depend on pollinators. So these are just some examples of things that bees pollinate for us, bees and other insects. And this is a rather nice demonstration of what the world would look like when we went shopping if we didn't have bees. So there's a nice supermarket full of stuff to eat, take away the bees, and that's what it would look like. It would be really hard, actually, to feed the world without pollination, because not only would we lose a third of the food, but we'd lose the most nutritious third of our food. We'd be left with the wind-pollinated crops. The two-thirds of the remainder of our food is mostly comprised of rice, wheat, barley, and so on, wind-pollinated grasses. But they're good for carbohydrates, but they're not terribly nutritious. All the vitamins and so on come from insect-pollinated plants. So why are these bees declining? What's going wrong? There isn't a single answer to that. It's a slightly complicated subject. And it's a combination of factors that are driving their declines. But there are three really big ones: disease, habitat loss, and pesticides. So firstly, disease is actually a big and complicated topic, which I haven't really got time to go into. But essentially, bees naturally have lots of diseases. They always have, and that's perfectly natural and normal. The problem is that we've moved bees around the world, particularly honeybees, which are domestic animals, and we've accidentally taken their diseases with them. So we've spread bee diseases around the world, and they're not diseases that are confined to honeybees. They'll happily also infect wild bees like bumblebees. So now all over the world, wild bees are being infected with non-native diseases that they haven't got resistance to. As I say, it's a complicated topic, but that will have to do for the disease aspect of it. Habitat loss is almost self-evident, and we've already heard to some extent about that. If you have a habitat like this, it's a great place for bees and other wildlife. And Britain alone used to have 7 million acres of flower-rich grasslands, hay meadows, and chalk downland like this. In the 20th century, we lost just below 98% of that habitat, virtually all of it, essentially. And it was replaced with crops, either cereals or oilseed rape, or sometimes with fields of silage, but fields which have no flowers at all. And if you're a bee, that's disastrous. If you take away the flowers, then you've got no food. Of course, you're also actually making this land completely inhospitable for all other forms of life apart from the crop itself. But from a bee's perspective, that's pretty disastrous. This picture actually then brings me to the third cause of bee declines, which is, of course, what's coming out the back of the tractor, pesticides. This is something that I've studied particularly in my lab at Sussex University. And I just want to share a few, it's a big subject. If you want to hear more, there are a couple of talks by me on YouTube about this. But I'm going to give you sort of some very brief highlights. So we've been studying the impacts of pesticides on wild bumblebees flying around in southern Britain. And to start with, as a sort of baseline, we wanted to know what pesticides farmers were using. So we contacted the local farmers around East Sussex and asked them if they'd tell us what pesticides they used on each crop. And this rather bewildering list of long names that I've put up is a list of the chemicals applied to one oilseed rape field in one growing season from when the crop was sown in August 2012 until when it was harvested in June 2013. There's 22 different synthetic chemicals going onto that crop. 2 of them are fertilizers, 20 different pesticide types. So you've got insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, molluscicides. They give them great names. You can see there, Cruiser and Shadow, they sound kind of ominous, don't they? Then poor old Gandalf appears in the middle. He's now apparently a pyrethroid insecticide. So I just ask you, and this, by the way, is not a bad farmer. He's just a typical farmer doing what his agronomist advises him to do. Every field was more or less the same on this farm and all the neighbouring farms. And I would just ask you this. If you were growing food to eat yourself or feed to your children, as I imagine many of you do, I've got a veggie patch in my garden, would you be comfortable putting 20 different pesticides on it and then serving it up to anybody? I wouldn't. I don't actually use any pesticides in my garden, but this is what happens to the food in the field. This is destined, some of it at least, for human consumption. And it raises all sorts of interesting issues about, obviously, human health. But from a bee's perspective, this is pretty disastrous. This is a flowering crop which bees go in to pollinate, and it's been drenched with a whole sequence of different types of insecticide and other chemicals that might be harmful. I'm just going to highlight one of those chemicals, though. So right at the top center, there's something called thiamethixum, which is used as a seed dressing on the oilseed rape when it was sown. So the farmer bought the seed pre-treated with stuff that's an insecticide. Thiamethixum belongs to a class of insecticides called neonicotinoids, which you might have heard of and have been particularly implicated in bee declines. And I'm just going to tell you a tiny bit more about them. So neonicotinoids are neurotoxins. They were introduced in the mid-90s, and they proved very popular. So that graph shows you how use of them has increased in the UK. The toxicity of insecticides or of any chemical is measured by an LD50 test, which stands for the lethal dose that kills 50% of your test subjects. And the honeybee is a standard test animal that all chemicals have to be tested on. I've just put up there the LD50 for imidacloprid, which is one of these neonicotinoids, versus DDT, which you'll have all heard of as a famously nasty chemical. It takes 4 nanograms, 4 billionths of a gram of imidacloprid to kill a honeybee. To put that in context, that means that 1 teaspoon, 5 grams, is enough to kill 1.25 billion honeybees. And we're applying 110,000 kilos of this stuff to the landscape every year. In comparison, DDT is pretty benign from a bee's point of view. It's about 7,000 times less toxic than this new generation of insecticides. The purple stuff top right, by the way, those are the coated seeds that the farmer buys. Now, these chemicals are quite persistent in the environment. So they're put on the seed and then sown in the ground. A little bit of dust blows away during the drilling process, and that dust is very toxic. But it's what happens next that is most alarming from an environmental point of view, because the idea is that the chemicals are drawn up by the crop and protect the crop from insect pests. But only about 5% of the active ingredient put on the seeds goes into the crop. Most of it goes into the soil, where they can last for years, or leaches into the groundwater and streams and ditches and ponds and so on, or is taken up by hedgerow flowers or hedgerow plants that have their roots going into the edge of the field. So we recently did some work and discovered that most wildflowers growing on arable farms in Britain, the pollen and nectar of the wildflowers contains these neurotoxins, which is pretty bad news for our bees and butterflies and hoverflies and so on. And also for anything else that lives in those hedgerows, because it isn't just the pollen and nectar that's contaminated, the leaves are contaminated. So if you're a butterfly caterpillar, you're also going to be getting a dose of a very potent neurotoxin if you live in that habitat. We've put bee nests out into the landscape and looked to see what pesticides are in the food that they collect. And this, apologies, it looks a bit complicated, but these are just stacked bars which show you the total amount of pesticides in the food that bees are collecting, actually specifically in the pollen stores. The red line, so the black bits at the bottom are the concentrations of neonicotinoids in particular, and the red line shows you the level that's known to be harmful to bees. And you can see that quite a lot of these pollen stores in bees' nests have considerably more of this stuff than would do, well, plenty to do them harm. But it's not, the reason I put this slide in is I wanted to illustrate that it isn't just about these neonicotinoids, the black bits at the bottom. Actually, the food that bees collect is full of pesticides, not just that particular class, but all sorts of stuff. It's a whole cocktail of chemicals, which can't be good for them. And there's plenty of evidence that it's not. So to sum up the kind of causes of decline part of this, there isn't a single reason bees are disappearing. It's a combination of factors. The poor bee is being stressed from all sides. It's hungry because there aren't many flowers left in modern intensive farmland compared to what we used to have. They're coping with non-native nasty diseases, including Asian bee diarrhea and various other things that you don't want to hear about. And they're not just being poisoned by one type of pesticide. They're actually constantly, chronically consuming a whole cocktail of pesticides. In fact, there'll be something in the news probably tonight or tomorrow. There's a new paper being published, which is embargoed until tonight, so it's not my work, but I can't tell you any details. But the long and the short of it is that 75% of honey samples collected from all around the world have neonicotinoid insecticides in them. This is stuff that you're going to eat. 75% of our bees are being exposed to these chemicals. That's pretty concerning. Anyway, if you're hungry and infected with the disease and being poisoned all at the same time, it's little wonder that they might occasionally die. What we need to avoid is this. These are people in southwest China hand pollinating their trees, their apple and pear trees, because there are no bees left in this part of the world. It's hard to imagine a farmer in this country hand pollinating his oilseed rape, so we definitely need to avoid getting to this state. Unless, of course, and finally I've come to the robots bit, unless, of course, we replace the bees with robot bees. There are a number of labs around the world that are taking this seriously. They realize that bees are disappearing, and the obvious solution to them is to build little robotic replacements, drones you might call them, sorry. Now, I can see from a robotics engineering kind of point of view why you might think that's a really interesting intellectual challenge, but it also terrifies the hell out of me. Bees, of course, are pretty good at pollinating. They've actually been pollinating flowers for about 130 million years, so they've had a lot of practice. And I'll be impressed if we can do better than that. But maybe we can, who knows? Technology is pretty smart these days. But then think about what would it cost? What resources would it require? At any point in time, there are about 3 trillion honeybees in the world, and that's just one of 20,000 species of bee. So replacing 3 trillion, building 3 trillion little robots, it's going to cost an awful lot of money, use a lot of resources, a lot of energy. They're going to break down, they're going to need maintaining, they'll get stuck in spiders' webs or caught out in the rain or who knows what. And we'll end up with a landscape covered in little prickly dead robot bees. Or perhaps Vladimir Putin will hack into the system and turn them against us, who knows. But it seems to me that sticking with the real thing, which is biodegradable, self-replicating, free, it gives us honey, it's carbon neutral, is infinitely preferable than going down this route. So let's hope we can find a way to look after the real thing. So what can we do? Well, unfortunately, I'm just coming to the end of my time, so I haven't actually got time to tell you what you can do. But the good news is there is actually a lot you can do to get involved. Conserving bees, in many ways, is a more tractable subject than worrying about tigers or polar bears or whatever, because you can get involved planting flowers, not using pesticides, and so on. If you want to find out more about that aspect of things, then read one of my books on the subject. So you've seen this picture before, but I just wanted to finish off by saying that it seems to me really odd that people would do anything at all for their children or their grandchildren apart from leaving them a decent planet to live on. There's a very real risk, as we all know, that our children or our grandchildren are going to inherit a world in which most of its natural resources have been used up and much of its natural beauty has been destroyed, and we really have to do better than that. And it says time up, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.